Hello, and welcome to this next episode of the Natural History Project. My name is Jason Brogdon. I am the Dean of Science Instruction for Founders Classical Academies. Today, I'd like to share with you Epigenesis Spirit. This path appears to me the only one that can lead to a knowledge of truth or of what comes nearest it, and it is clear that such knowledge is more profitable to us than the error which might fill its place. I cannot doubt, therefore, that it is this path which we must follow. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Epigenetics brings to mind the earlier idea of life being a representation of anti-entropic phenomena at its finest. Ongoing complexity, adaptability, and engagement with non-living forces in the context of time that only moves in one direction, much like a river. It is this metaphor which has given me much reflection as a theologian, science educator, and as a human being. We all reminisce and perhaps all wish we had more time or could return to another time in the past, and popular movies have been made on such notions. But time is like a river, moving forward and eroding and dissolving everything in its path. We as living creatures, moving against the grain or against the tide per se. In anti-entropy, feel the force of time the longer we remain in it. Eventually we tire, we erode, we dissolve, and lose our footing in the unrelenting magnitude. We must give it all back and surrender to the inevitable flood of entropy. At least for a little while, we felt what it was like to move in a different direction against that mindless uniformity. At least we felt what it meant to be alive. At least we could rage against the dying of the light. Despite its recent appropriations by multiple aspects of the new field of epigenetics as a foil to the modern synthesis, and by modern synthesis, I mean this amalgamation of Mendelian genetics and Darwinian natural selection, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's biology is actually quite consistent with the historical natural selection as articulated by Charles Darwin. The French naturalist is best known for his 1809 Zoologie philosophique and has been traditionally seen as a forerunner in the century of Darwin and consequently conceptually defeated by the publication of The Origin of Species in 1859. Darwin expressed admiration for Lamarck, however, and read him extensively. It's a subpoint of this podcast to realign the influence Lamarck had on Darwin and to at least demonstrate the historical appropriateness in the present of maybe adding his ideas to the already incredible successful integration of Mendel and Darwin. It's highly probable that current evolutionary science could be witnessing an even deeper synergy of Darwinian descent, Mendelian genetics, and Lamarckian development to fully articulate the dynamic conversation of an organism's DNA, its metabolic phenotype, and the environment. Many others have already integrated concepts within a Darwinian framework in order to explain various phenomena over the past century, such as Fisher, Haldane, Dobzhansky, and Gould. It's time to begin the process of formulating a new set of criteria, intellectual framing, and educational scaffolding so that biologists can at least have new mental space in which to accurately assess the streams of new data pouring in from a myriad of epigenetic case studies, some of which will be linked to this podcast. Lamarck's Zoologie philosophique was written much earlier than the publication of Darwin's seminal work, yet many interpret it as a type of contention or alternative view. As John Hedley Brooke has shown, the enterprise of evolutionary biology continues long after debates, challenges, and even major epistemological overhauls. However, Lamarck's name has been absent from the discussion until recently. The current utilization of this historical figure in biological science testifies to the proud use of a rich tradition in biology and the basic fact that the science of life has a treasure trove of paradigms to call upon in order to deal with the unusual history of our knowledge of how organisms persevere on this planet. The most interesting and relevant, I think, is Lamarck's first and second laws, and so I have a summary here. In every animal that has not reached the term of its development, the more frequent and steady use of any given organ gradually strengthens this organ, develops it, increases its size, and gives it a power proportional to the duration of this use. Whereas the constant failure to use such an organ imperceptibly weakens it, deteriorates it, progressively decreases its faculties, and finally makes it disappear. The concept of acquisition used in reference to Lamarck was never elaborated with precision. His term of the use organ is dated and not precise given all the new developments of cellular biology and genetics. Transmission was not a concern, thus he had no contest with what we know of as genetics. He was interested in how organisms acquire the traits in the first place, and so Lamarck was fully aware of both limits and basic methods of genetics without having the science established in his day. He wanted to know why the species concept was the primary reference of transformation. What if the transformation was smaller and more discrete than an entire organism? And so consequently, adaptation was a word that Lamarck never used. For Lamarck, acquisitions are modifications that are caused by factors external to the organism, and they bring pressure to bear on it through circumstances not that much unlike Darwin. They put it in peril and therefore create a need that sets, and here's the difference, internal powers, what he called fluids and forces, in motion. And so by the intermediary and rudimentary quote unquote organ that eventually appears through frequent use or development. And so I think where he says the word organ, maybe we could understand it as a small organized unit. As we have seen, the concept of acquisition became more precise as a function of cellular discoveries and Giard's work at the turn of the century. It differentiated somatic elements from the reproductive elements. And so for him, the acquired was defined as a somatic or a body modification sufficient enough to profoundly alter the reproductive elements. The debate can get confusing due to the genetic and metabolic complexity of an organism, making it hard to discern whether the trait is an innate variation or something newly acquired through a given pathway from the external environment. Now, personally, I think it's also fun to know that I don't really like the word species. I use it in normal biology speak and teach it to students. But in the trajectory of Lamarck's work, I think perhaps it's best to think in terms of a series rather than a species. Because life can hack, edit, delete, and alter its own DNA and come up with iterations and versions of itself, but it's in continuity and in response to the environment in incremental steps. So like episodes in a series or a series of iPhones from 1 all the way to 16. Altering small bits of code can have dramatic phenotypic effects. The question comes into focus even sharper now because biologists must ask if the environment, abiotic physics, is blindly causing random changes in the genetic code, or is the cell responding to its own programming? More succinctly, is variation spontaneous or somewhat intentional or developmental. It might be best to regard DNA as an inherited organelle of the cell and not merely a blueprint locked in a vault. If that is the case, then the need to revisit Lamarck's references to quote-unquote organs as a focal point for the law of use and disuse becomes really crystallized. The problem with utilizing the history of biology, though, is that it seems to be written in reverse. And the goal of a formalized, systematic study of living organisms is to understand the very nature of life on this planet. But life can't be abstracted from its context of the environment, but that is exactly what biology wants to do. And so the emphasis is placed fully on the range of organisms within our realm to teach us about what's possible. And so ask the animals and they will teach you, says Job. And so the problem is the history of biology has come out backwards. They started classifying under Aristotle, but it wasn't until millennia later that we're understanding the very basis of the cellular units and of the genetic code. And so no wonder there are so many debates. So, as such philosophical questions were placed on the table in history, the lack of knowledge, technology, and depth of historical appreciation for ancient life was lacking. As I said, organisms were classified in an Aristotelian scheme long before they were understood properly, and the tradition of classification preceded the practice of genetic analysis by thousands of years. And even Charles Darwin had little to no knowledge of Mendelian inheritance patterns, despite the fact that the Augustinian monk reached out to him via a letter and it was never opened. So such an odd history of progress and development in biological sciences placed the discipline in an interesting philosophical position, needing to revamp its foundations quite frequently. Ideally, it would have been superior to know what an organism truly is at the molecular level before attempting to classify it. It's not wrong that it happened, but it certainly requires extensive debates and intellectual overhauls from time to time to untangle these knots. The heredity of acquired characteristics is becoming what Pierre Vieux-Saint-Pont dares to call the greatest debate. The environment claims its rights on organic modifications, even though the genes do not surrender. The unique and graduated series of living beings is the very order of nature. The knowledge of origins and the analysis of natural connections replace labels and nomenclatures whose artificial character stands in opposition to the real order of nature. Cambridge Press, 1982. And so, whether one is talking about the real order of nature or at least the ability to understand it, the central issue remains that big arguments should concentrate on what question of what life is actually capable of versus what current paradigms allow for. Biological science should permit its object of study to determine its methods. Lamarck himself exclaimed, "True objects are not the result of classification." It's known that every science has or must have its philosophy. It's also known that every science achieves real progress only through its philosophy. And so with one stroke, Lamarck became the founder of biology and of the philosophy of transformism. Lamarck and Darwin both felt that variation and the species concept to be shifting and poorly defined. Classification would need a major overhaul if they were correct. And though Lamarck hesitated over the question of total extinctions, he shared with Darwin a belief that morphological similarities indicated continuity of descent. Lamarck, however, in his final pages offers a sage observation. He says, "It's not enough to discover and prove a useful truth, but that it is necessary also to be able to propagate it and get it recognized." For this effort, I'll say Lamarck, as we've seen, was too old, too inept, too poor, and too ahead of his time. Darwin is often pictured as similarly launching his frail bark upon the restless intellectual currents of his day, but there is one difference. He had acquired Lamarck's bitterly learned wisdom by the way of the worldly wise geologist Charles Lyell. His book was not launched alone. That is from Lauren Isley, Darwin's Century, Chapter 7. Where Lamarck's insight is that he saw a renewed interior for adjustment as a modifying force, Darwin posited environmental change altered what he thought were germ modifications from without. And so one has to ask, why can't both be right? Why can't life have energy to interact with an external environment? This would be a dangerous idea. I'd like to introduce a new word to most American listeners, and that is the word bricolage. In her work, Lamarck, the Mythical Precursor, Madeleine Barthélemy Madale asked, what does the term philosophy signify in conjunction with the adjective zoological? It expresses demand for generalization, for systemization, for unification. It requires the subsumption of details, of the infinity of facts under principles. In a word, it expresses the need for theory. When we think about the evolution of life, most of us marvel at all the new ideas, new kinds of feathers and flowers and mating rituals. But at the gene level, evolution proves to be remarkably conservative. The sequence shows up again and again in different guises and different genes and different lineages. The French word for this is bricolage, the construction of things using what is at hand, the patchwork quilt. This is from Ursula Goodenough, The Sacred Depths of Nature. The living world is in motion, and therefore life must be also if it is to continue. A new mechanism dwelling within every creature makes response to the environment possible. It's evident that there are in fact changes occurring at the genetic level, but these changes are not the result of random copying errors. Some are, and that is the basis for disease. Rather, another source of information, the epigenome, is influencing the expression of genes. The science of epigenetics, though new, provides another solution, a better description of what is being currently observed in the natural world. The wide range of diversity man observes in the creatures on this planet and the ones that used to dwell, it all stems from a mechanism responsible for ordered reactions to a changing environment. The word bricolage is a French word, originating during the 1960s actually, and it means to create something new from the old or available resources. In its old usage, the verb form, the word bricoleur, referred to an individual occurrence or even a consistent reality, like that of a ball bouncing or a dog wandering away. It was something, an object that was initiated and it continues. In its old use, the word was mainly used to refer to ball games or hunting where an event was started or something was put, like I said, in motion and is still going on its trajectory. But really, it just can consistently refer to an individual movement throughout the sport or the action. So the word carries an indirect meaning. The bricoleur, or the one performing the action, is skilled at what he does and makes use of materials that are already present. And so the bricoleur works with resources present only in his current reality. In other words, he doesn't acquire different tools or different materials each time he encounters a new project or challenge, but rather pulls from the materials already present in his area or field. He makes do with what is available, possessing a finite number of tools at all times. Because the composition of this set is not related to the current project or in any case any particular project, but it's contingent upon all the occasions that can be renewed with current stock. And so the brickalore redefines and reuses the means he already has in his possession. Now, what's cool about this, I think, is the cell is the brickalure, and the cell inherits chemicals, protein foldings, and DNA code from a previous generation, and that's what it has to work with. And so the epigenetic mechanism at work in living creatures, I think, acts in a similar way. As external factors shift, the internal components and workings of DNA remain the same. But upon encountering new challenges, threats that might endanger the cell's likelihood of survival, or varying abiotic factors, the tools within the genetic makeup remain constant, but they're able to be shaped in their function in previous occasions. The switches discovered around these developmental genes are vast, and all the pathways and mechanisms within living cells remain a key part of their development and functioning. And so, similar to the brickalure, these tools and functions are used to increase an organism's fitness to a dynamic environment. I think what I'd like to put forward as I conclude is basically this. I think that I'd like to migrate not away from, but maybe change the focus from survival of the fittest to arrival of the fittest. I think I'd like to leave the idea that random copying errors and mutations give rise to all the beautiful diversity and functionality that we see. Mutations do occur, and that mistakes do happen. Most of those are benign, but when they're not, they're usually deadly. I do hold, obviously, that the DNA does change, but I'm wondering if, instead of a random copying error, it's an intentional, directional, albeit somewhat tweaking alteration of the genetic code. And so I think instead of one category, we might have two. My risky suggestion is we have a category of mutations, random copying errors, and then we have, to use the French word, bricolations, intentional tweaking and altering of the genetic code by the cell in direct response to the environment. This paper, honestly, is an expression of bricolation itself, since it is the combined efforts of university-level biology research, programs, professors, and articles, efforts by students and discussions to come alongside this biology instructor's call for a new type of category and educational scaffolding, both within the science and within the classroom, with which to contend with subjects like evolution, phylogeny, genetics, and the history of life. My name is Jason Brogdon. I am recording this on October 9th, 2025 at Lakeway Studios in Lewisville, Texas for the Natural History Project. Thanks for listening.